Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Greetings of peace, my brothers and sisters. This is Baraka Blue, and you are tuned into Path and Present Podcast. I just want to thank you all for listening. I'm really moved every time somebody sends me a message or I go do an event and someone comes up to me and say, I love your podcast, or I love this specific guest, or I love this topic, or I wish you would talk about this, or maybe you should have so-and-so on. It means a lot to me because, this podcast is for me a labor of love. It's something that I do kind of on the side in addition to my music and my poetry and my teaching endeavors. So, it's something that I can sometimes put on the back burner and put on the side because it's not really, it's just something I do out of love, And sometimes when I'm doing it, I'm like, man, I got to focus on other projects, which is what I've been doing recently. I've been focusing on, a series of workshops, which I'll talk about. But whenever somebody says, I love it, or I connected with it, or it meant a lot to me, I'll get things like this girl in London mentioned to me, like a specific podcast changed her life, and she focused on an idea that we talked about in the podcast for her master's thesis. Like she decided to research into something. So that means a lot to me because I really believe in the power of this medium. I've been really moved by podcasts and just the freedom of it, and that it can be long form, and that nobody controls it, and nobody can, we don't have any sponsors that we're beholden to, or if we say something wrong that they'll cut their sponsorship or take us off the air. It's 100% free, and I try to be really real and raw in this because the podcasts that speak to me are ones where the hosts and the people talking are really honest and there's no pretense. So, that said, if you dig it, if you enjoy it, please let us know. You can write me at Baraka Blue on Twitter. And, suggest anything. If there's someone you'd like to have on, if you're interested in a specific topic, if you liked something that we said in the podcast or didn't like or object to something, I'd love to hear all that. It means a lot to me to know that people are engaging with it and people are listening and reflecting on it. So it's always good to hear that feedback. If you want to support financially, there's the Patreon, and you can find the link in the SoundCloud or the iTunes. Let's see. So this podcast is with Omid Safi, who is a professor of Islamic studies and who focuses on Sufism and Sufi thought. His new book is called Radical Love. And we're here in this podcast talking about his new book, which I've had the blessing of reading over for the last few weeks. And he sent me a copy. And it's great. It's really great. It's a collection of poems from different Sufi poets. And, you have some ones that are well known like Rumi, but you also have many poets who are lesser known from that same tradition. And he also has some introductory remarks, kind of contextualizing it and discussing it. And I really liked this podcast just to get to talk to him about that. So I hope you like it as well. Before I give you the podcast, there was a few updates or announcements that I want to make sure people are aware of. The first one is that I've been doing some online workshops, writing workshops. We call it Opening the Eye of the Heart, and it is a 4-week contemplative writing workshop. What that means is that it's really not just about creativity, but it's about self-discovery. And we study about Sufi poetry. We read various Sufi poems, and we read poets of mystics of other traditions as well, East and West. And then we have some secondary reading about the craft of poetry, but also about the symbolism of Sufi poetry. And we also have lessons, and I have some videos and commentaries and exercises and all type of things. But really, for me, also what's amazing about it is we have a closed Facebook group that serves as our kind of virtual classroom, and people can comment and interact and, connect with a group of people who are creative people on the spiritual path. And it's been really transformative for me just to be a part of such an eclectic beautiful group of people from all over the world. So if that type of thing sounds interesting to you, I highly encourage you to come join us. We're currently doing the summer course, but the fall course is open. September 2nd, it begins. And the website is rumicenter.bigcartel.com. That's rumicenter.bigcartel.com. And there you can learn more about it, can read testimonials of previous participants, and you can also register if you are interested. And yeah, it's been really amazing, and it's really encouraged me to develop a few other courses. So a few other courses are in the works. Inshallah, we'll have one for Rabi al-Awwal about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Make dua for that. And then lastly, I have some tour dates. I will be going to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore this summer in late July and early August. So I'm really excited about this because it's organized by an organization called Embara, who is a great organization of people, mostly in Malaysia. Some of them are in Singapore. And I've had the ability and the honor to do some programs with them in the past. But this time they're arranging a much larger tour. And for this tour, the kind of the opening of this tour is a week in Java. Java is the largest island in Indonesia, and it is the home of the Wali Sango. So the Wali Sango means the 9 saints, the 9 awliya who brought the deen of La ilaha illallah to this region, the sages who brought the deen here. And so we're going to be studying this historically, looking at the places they went and how they did it, and really how they articulated the deen to this different context. And we'll be visiting their shrines, etc. And the blessing of it for me, among many blessings, is that it will be led by Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah and Sheikh Muhammad al-Jilani. And these are 2 of my teachers, 2 of my elders, who I've benefited immensely from. Many of you will know Sheikh Muhammad al-Jilani is a great Qadri Sufi sheikh from West Africa, from the Gambia, who I've had the blessing of visiting in the Gambia a number of times for their annual conference, their Qadri conference. And Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah is one of the prominent Muslim thinkers, intellectuals in the West, and also a Sufi sheikh himself. So just to spend time in their presence is really what it's about. But, it's going to be an amazing, amazing tour. If you're interested in it, there is a website. Let me see. Okay, here it is. It's warsito.embara.org. WARSITO.embara, EMBARA, warsito.embara.org. So Embara is a cool organization, and they're spearheading this and organizing it, and I'm really honored to take part. And then if you go to my Facebook, in the coming weeks, I'll be posting the events and the flyers for Malaysia and Singapore. Those haven't been released yet, but you have now the website for the first week in Indonesia, so check that out. All right. Yes, without further ado, I want to give you this episode of Path and Present podcast, and here is my conversation with Omid Safi. MashaAllah. Bismillah. So I guess the first thing I would say is congratulations and thank you for this book. It's been wonderful to be reading over it, and I hope you don't mind that I've marked it up a bit and folded over corners, but that to me is a sign of a book well loved and since it is a book of radical love, I'm
There
radical
you go.
book right now.
There you go. A lot of the most radical loves look kind of worn.
That's right.
And I think if it looks pristine, then you got to be a little suspicious about that, because then it's decoration. It's not a book that somebody's kind of sat with and worked through. So I'm always honored, and I love both aesthetics. I love the aesthetic of really honoring the pristine nature of a book, and I've got some books that I keep like that. But I also love, and this too is a part of our tradition, of course, of the marginalia. And so many of the great commentaries of our tradition were things that people were scribbling on the margins of the books, and then on the margins of the margins, and the margins of the margins of the margins. And so I think both ways have their own adab and their own beauty. So it's all good. It's all good.
That's right. So I know a few years ago, you sent me an article that you had written. I forget the exact title, but it was about this mazhabi ishq, the path of radical love, of ishq. And I really enjoyed reading over that. So I know this is a topic that you are not new to, that you've been reading and reflecting and kind of steeping yourself in this tradition for many years. So for those that are less familiar, I'd love for you to just briefly introduce what is the path of radical love, what is the mazhabi ishq, maybe a little bit about the kind of historical formation and key players, but more importantly, the kind of principles and what separates this path from other paths.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. So, that term madhab in Arabic, or mazhab in Persian, Turkish, Urdu pronunciation. We know that term from people talking about, do you follow this madhab or that madhab? Are you a Shafi'i or a Hanbali or a Hanafi or a Jafari, and so on. And certainly the people that we're talking about here, the most famous ones would be people like Rumi, Ahmed Ghazali, Ain al-Ghudat Hamedani, Attar, Hafiz, Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, Kharaqani, and so on. They all had their own legal madhab that they followed. They didn't all follow the same legal madhab. They had different legal madhabs that they would be following. But they also said, oftentimes when people would ask them of what is really your madhab, they said, well, the point of having a path is that the path should take you to Allah. That's the whole point of having a path. And so they started to talk about love. And of course, in all of these beautiful languages, we've got 15 different words for love. And the word that they kept coming back to was this word, ishq, which isn't just sweet and gentle love. This is a fiery kind of love. And so that was one reason that I settled eventually on this term radical love, because of course, the term radical, which nowadays it's used in all kinds of ways that are maybe not so helpful, but the term radical means to go back to the root of something. That's the original meaning of the term radical. So a radical love is a kind of love that takes you back to the root, to the heart of who you are. So, when you got somebody like Rumi who begins the Masnavi with that wonderful line that, this is the book of the rhyme and couplets, this is the Masnavi, and it is the root of the root of the root of the faith, right? You could translate that as, this is some radical, radical, radical stuff.
Right.
And I think sometimes that kind of a translation might convey something more to people today than another one would. So, the idea that they basically had The reality that they had and they were living was that this radical love is not an emotion. Contrary to kind of how we tend to talk about love, that I have love towards you and I love you and I like you, but I don't know if I'm in love with you, and all that kind of nonsense that we waste so many decades of our lives on. For them, ishq is not even just a quality of Allah. Ishq is actually the very being of Allah. It is, and they said that ishq is the overflowing of Allah that brings us into creation. It's as if God's love for creation was bubbling over. It was so ecstatic that that God has to give birth to the world so that we can come to know God intimately. And so in that way, they talk about love not as an emotion, not as a sentiment. As I sometimes tell my students these days, love is not an emoji. It's not something you text somebody. And it's not even something that you feel. Love is this unleashing of God onto creation. It is this cosmic current that has poured out of God, has brought us here, sustains us here. And if we can just get over our own sense of ego, our own sense of being this finite self, cut off from each other, and if we can just merge with this cosmic current, that same love is going to carry us back to Allah.
I think that's beautiful, and I think that is so important, and I'm really interested in exploring deeply this idea, because love is thrown around, and love,
Yeah.
it's the same word you use for your favorite candy bar and your mother, so it's it can become a trite thing, but in the way that the Sufis are using it, it is the deepest thing. It is the essence of the essence. It is the root of the root. It is the center of our being, and it is the ultimate reality. And one way that I know Rumi and others in this tradition explore this is through this idea of majazi and haqiqi, right? So metaphorical love and real, true love. And my understanding, I'd love to hear you explore it more, but that this idea that actually love for anything other than God is actually metaphorical love, and that all you can really love and what you do love, every beloved, is actually behind that is the divine beloved, whether you see it or not.
You're right, exactly. So, here's the interesting thing. This distinction of love as a metaphor and then the real love. This is certainly something that has been around since the beginning of Islamic thought. And many Sufis, even before this distinct path of radical love shows up, had talked about this distinction between real love and metaphorical love. And that distinction never entirely goes away. You can find it, as you said, in Rumi, where Rumi tells you, don't fall in love just with somebody's pretty form, their surat. Because the form is going to change. And if all that you have fallen in love with from somebody is the beautiful face, what you going to do when the beautiful face starts getting wrinkles on it? Mm-hmm. Right? So that distinction does linger. But, and I think this is a really kind of important development that really, it's good to sit with it, because sometimes I'm a little saddened that even among folks who really love the Sufi tradition, that this next point isn't sufficiently embraced. So, everybody, of course, has heard of Imam Ghazali, and he's called the proof of Islam, Hujjatul Islam, and some people would compare him to a Aquinas or St. Augustine as, the greatest of the Muslim theologians. Well, he's got this younger brother named Ahmad Ghazali. And Ahmad, in some ways, at least for the people in this radical love tradition, is always said to have been a greater saintly being than his older brother. They always say that Abu Hamid or Muhammad Ghazali was the greater scholar, but the younger brother was on fire. He was the one whose heart really had been burnt through this kind of a love. And Ahmad he's the one that really writes the book on radical love. He writes a fantastic book called Savaneh, which has been translated into English by a great scholar of Sufism named Nasrullah Purjavadi. And, if you love Platonic dialogues, you will like the Savaneh. It is a beautiful, rich, dense, metaphysical reflection on ishq. And in the first paragraph is where he pushes the conversation beyond what had by that point been a 300-year-old distinction between real love and metaphorical love. And what he says, Ahmad Ghazali says, is, if it was up to me, I would have never written a book about love, because we know that the reality of love is so much more subtle and so much more luminous than just words on a page. But my friends begged me, and so I agreed. I relented, and I agreed that I would write something for them on one condition: that you never ask me and you never bifurcate this love into the love of the Creator or the love of humanity, because there is one love. And this was a bold idea in the history of Sufi thought and practice. This notion that love, once you have purged it of all of these illusions and delusions that we occupy ourselves with, and once you've gotten your ego a little bit under control and out of the way, that there is one love. That whether you are loving a mama, a baba, a brother, a sister, a child, a friend, a neighbor, a stranger, a spiritual teacher, a prophet, or Allah, that this is all one love. And that to learn to really love another human being isn't just a metaphor. And it's not just the alphabet that we got to learn before we can love Allah. It is actually the very same love that has poured out of God. The reason that we can love each other is because Allah has loved us. And if we claim, this point, we are all struggling with this point even today. If somebody claims to be a religious person, if somebody claims to love God, the very first thing that you got to pay attention to is, do they love God's creation? And so this notion of a one love, which Ahmad Ghazali is very explicit on. He says that, the love that there is from God to us, between us as humans and Allah, all of this love is of one essence. It is one color. It is one nature. So he actually pushes the conversation much further beyond what had been a very established and respected tradition of the majazi and the haqiqi, the metaphorical and the real love. And that older distinction never goes away, because, as you said so beautifully, Rumi himself cites that in the Masnavi as well. But they add this tradition of a one love idea. And I think that's a really powerful very distinctive part of the Sufi tradition that develops in the mazhab-e-ishq, in the path of radical love.
That's very beautiful. And it reminds me of this Sufi teaching story you hear all the time, where there was a young, overzealous disciple who wished to take the path with a certain spiritual master, Sufi sheikh. And he went to the sheikh and he said, "Oh, sheikh, take me as your student." And the sheikh said, "Oh, young man, have you ever been in love?"
Yeah.
And the disciple said, "No." And he said, "Go fall in love and then come back and I'll teach you." So it's this idea that if you haven't experienced human love, then
Right.
what can the spiritual path do for you? That it's actually a bridge, and it is a way that we taste and we experience, and it leads us then to be able to awaken to a deeper divine love. And then, like you say, you realize, in fact, that when you love the beautiful scent of the rose, or a beautiful face, or a majestic sunset, or a mountain range, or when you love justice in the world, or when you love mercy of a mother bird to her little baby bird, that in reality, all those things, whether beauty or majesty or justice or mercy, all of those are names of Allah. All of those are traits of God. And so what you are is you're loving God. You're experiencing God, and you're loving God through these manifest forms, whether you realize it or not.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think Ahmed Ghazali's main student and disciple and commentator, Ain al-Ghazat, at one point he sort of, you can imagine him talking to one of his own followers, and the guy's like, "Yeah, I don't feel any love in my heart. I can't feel like I'm capable of the love of Allah." And he basically just asked him, like, "Do you love your mama? Do you love trees? Do you love a river when your feet are dangling in a river?" And the one that I love, and we get so little of this in the Muslim tradition, he says, "Do you love snow? Do you love it when the first snowfall comes? And do you dance in it like a child? Like, do you love snow? And if you do, then you've tasted love. You know love." And I find that that's such a beautiful and powerful thing for us to remind ourselves, because so many of the people that I meet, they tell me, "Oh, I live a loveless existence, that I've been searching for love, but I can't find it." And I think, especially for folks who live in the West, or who have grown up in the West, or whose kind of aesthetic and spiritual life has been shaped by some of the mores of the West, it's because we have taken this rainbow of love, which actually extends to even colors that we can't see, and we've collapsed all of it to this one romantic notion of love, which is physical and sexual. And then, we sit there and we complain about the fact that one person who's supposed to fulfill us isn't showing up. And instead, I think what these Sufis of the radical love path are doing is they're telling us, you got 7 billion outlets for love, and that's just the human ones. Right? Can you love a kitten? Can you love a puppy? Can you love a tree? Can you love a brook? Can you love snowfall and sunshine on your face? And one of the great mystics that I've got in the book, a woman, she talks about, it's because I love Allah that I have to love His handiwork. Right. So I think there's also a kind of way that also opens up, a possibility.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite hadith from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I'm not sure if it's in the text, but it's one of those ones which I think people misread a lot, because it says, "This world and everything in it is cursed, except for dhikr Allah, remembrance of God, and that which is an aid thereto, or that which assists you to remember God." And the interesting thing about that is, one way to read that is, oh, this whole world is cursed. All I need to do is pray and fast and, guard myself from the cursed world. But that's an extremely superficial reading, because if you just look at it for a split second and reflect on it, you'll see that the common denominator is the subjective self, because another way to say the exact same thing is nothing in this world is cursed if you remember God by it or through
That's
it.
right.
And so it's you. And so the same two people can see the same rose or the same face or the same movie or the same whatever. And they're having a totally different experience vis-a-vis the soul and the creator. And it's the exact same outward manifestation, but the common denominator is the subject, the self. And so, that is really the challenge, I think, of the path that the prophet is calling us to see everything as a reminder, everything as an ayat, as a sign, everything as a divine message.
Yeah, and I think when that kind of moment of realization comes, it's almost a sort of Zen-like moment of becoming awakened into this kind of consciousness. One of the poems that I still remember when I was going through Rumi's Divan, the love poetry collection of Rumi, and he's got this beautiful poem that I translated in the book, and I just got goosebumps the first time that I read that poem. I liked it so much that I spent some time trying to figure out how to put it in a decent poetic English. So I may just read a little bit of that sort of for you. So he's talking about when he experiences this sense of love, and he talks about love as being personified here. He starts talking to love. So it begins by him loving a human being. He describes her the way that many of our poets did, as a moon-like beauty. Moon-like beauty. And of course, anybody who knows the Nasheed tradition, we all know that the prophet is, of course, always compared to a moon and a full moon, and so is a beloved, a human beloved. So, the moon-like beauty could refer simultaneously to your wife, or it could refer to your husband, or it could refer to the prophet. And, there's a beautiful fluidity in this kind of tradition. So, he talks about here, I'll just read this. He says, last night I became love crazed, Majnun. Love saw me and said, so love actually starts talking to him. He says, I've come, don't shout, say nothing. I said, love, I'm afraid of something else. Right? And of course, so much of our life, even when we're fallen in love, we're afraid of what may happen and what the consequence of this love may be. So I just said, I'm afraid of something else. Love said, there is nothing else. Say nothing. Let me whisper secrets in your ear. Say nothing. And then at this point is when, like, Rumi's starting to have his Zen-like moment, that he's figuring out that this love, it's not quite human. There's something more luminous to this experience of love. So he says, what a beauty. Are you an angel or a human? And love said, not an angel, not a human. Say nothing. Right? So then he just starts completely freaking out. And he's like, okay, so if you're not an angel, and if you're not a human, and let's hope you're not a jinn, like, then what's left? And the only thing, of course, that's left is Allah. Right? Because in love, when you burn away, there's nothing that is left except Allah. So he said, going back to the poem, he said, I said, what is this? Say it. Love said, stay like this. Say nothing. I said, my heart, isn't this God? Isn't this God's quality? Love said, yes, my child. By hush, say nothing. And so, I mean, there are powerful, transformative experiences here that they are hinting at, they are leading us to through um, these kinds of passages and poems and stories. And there is a pull, there's a direct laser beam pull into God's own heart and the divine embrace that they are calling us to, provided we're just willing to deal again with what would stand in the way of that love, and that is our nafs, that is our ego. And here we got to be able to distinguish between when do we love somebody because it makes us feel good, and when is it that we actually want that boundary between the self and the other to go away, when we want this me quality to go away, and we just want to merge with this cosmic current of love.
Yeah. I love, poetically, it's so striking how he says, how you translated, I'm afraid of something else. And just the vagueness, there's no specific thing, but it doesn't even matter what else it is. That's the point. I'm afraid of something else. There is nothing else.
There is nothing else.
And that's so beautiful, that just the vagueness of that, but that it doesn't matter, whatever you fill in the blank, you know what I mean? Like, and you know, what that really brings for me is that, you know, my experience, there's been experiences that I've had, you know, and people talk about on the path, right? If you have openings or, you know, Allah gives you kind of expansions or kind of tajalliyat, spiritual experiences, the moment that you start to you go up to your mind and you say, oh my God, I'm having an experience, you lose it. So it's like, just be in the love. And when you go back and you're just present, then you can actually, but when you try to like conceptualize it and place it in a box and you lose it. And even in mundane things, the first time that I experienced this consciously was when I was playing basketball as a middle schooler, because that's, at that time in my life, that's all I did. And I got pretty good, but there were certain moments where something would change and like the court would shift and my vision would shift, and you know, they call it like being in a flow state, and I couldn't miss, and I knew where the pass was going to go before it went, and I could make shots, you know, over and over again. But the moment that I started to think about it and rationalize it and go, oh my God, I'm in the zone, I'm on fire, I would lose it, you know. And so it was it's this amazing thing where, you know, we want to remove duality and we don't want to, but where we over intellectualize things, we actually take ourselves out of the ability to experience.
That's right. And I think, you know, one of the, one of my favorite movies is Princess Bride. And there's this wonderful line in it where one of the characters says, I do not think that word means what you think it means, you know? And I think sometimes we get ourselves into a deep trouble, when we start reading a lot of Muslim texts, and in particular Sufi texts, when they're using the words that we have seen before, but they're not using them in the way that we have seen before. So in a lot of this kind of path of radical love, like you'll see them criticize reason and rationality and even intellect, right? But what they mean by intellect isn't the same thing that the Muslim philosophers mean by intellect. They're talking about this feeble attempt to try to get the eternal and incomprehensible and transcendent God of all the universes and make him fit into our limited, finite understanding, which for them is a method of idol making. And so, you know, Ibn Arabi says this so beautifully, that the qalb, the heart, one of the meanings of the word qalb, of course, is something that changes, something that transforms. And it is only the heart that can comprehend God as long as it remains changing. as long as every understanding of God that you have continues to grow and evolve, and you never step in the same river twice.
That's right.
Right? And so when the Sufis are talking about don't think too hard, part of what they're talking about is, be in that moment. Hush, say nothing. Stay in this fire of divine love and let it work on you. Let it cook you. And kind of, without getting too explicit kind of about this, one of the reasons that their poetry at times gets so sensual is because there is something about the act of lovemaking which gives you a little taste of this mystical experience where the boundary between you and another is dissolved, at least just for a few minutes, for a few moments. You don't know where your body ends and her body begins. And for the mystics, there is something not just sensual, but also spiritual about that particular practice of union. Because, of course, what they're going for is a sense, that experience of being closer to Allah, feeling like they are one with Allah, and that the ego has just gone away. And so the way that they talk about this in this poetic language, and again, they're not writing a book of theology here, right? So, and many of these same mystics, including Rumi, in the daytime, they would be teaching classes on law and theology. They know that language. But at nighttime, they are singing love songs. And so these were the great masters of switching discourses. And they tell us time and time again that one of the greatest sources of confusion is when we insist on reading one body of Islamic literature through the framework of somebody else. Right? So, Rumi's got this beautiful little poem, and I've thought about this one for a while. And I think what's so amazing about this is you can read this as the experience of a mystical union with Allah. You could also read this as the greatest bit of marriage counseling that there has ever been. And I think it's true on both of those levels and 18 other levels that, we haven't even talked about. So here's what he says. And he just addresses this poem to faithful friend. Faithful friend. And the reason that this works so beautifully and ambiguously is, of course, that word friend, dost in Persian, dost in Turkish, the friend is one of the words that these Sufis had for Allah. Right? They say that there is a love affair with Allah in which God is still the Lord, is still the king, is still the master, and he becomes a friend, and he becomes a lover and a beloved. Right? So and of course in Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish, Urdu, we didn't have capital letters. So when they call somebody friend, it could be just, your earthly buddy, friend, pal. It could be your lover, beloved. It could be your spiritual teacher. It could be the prophet, or it could also be Allah, right? So here's what he says in the poem. He says, faithful friend, come closer. Right? And that already should recall the description of the Mi'raj, where the prophet is told to come closer. It says, let go of you and I. Let go of these notions of a you and an I. Come quickly. And then this is the part that I love so much. recently used this in the wedding ceremony of one of my very dear friends. He says, "You and I have to live as if you and I never heard of the you and an I."
Beautiful.
It is. And you know, like I've thought about this, and I've thought about you know, a lot of the folks that I speak with, and in a previous existence, I too was one of these people who find themselves in a really difficult relationship, a really difficult marriage, and you know, where your relationship or your marriage becomes some kind of a hostile accounting firm. And it's, you know, I took out the trash, but it's your turn to do the dishes. And I have done this 4 times and you've only done it 3 times, right? And there's no joy that comes out of that. The work already has to happen at a deeper level, at the heart level, to fix things. And what he's saying here is, what if you and I related to each other as if we had never heard of this distinction between a you and an I? What if we were just in it for the we? And, you know, again, whether you take that as just a simple poem between friends, between lovers, or even in terms of our relationship with God, you know, I think there's so much that it has to offer us that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually 3 poems in here that kind of I really like and that you kind of touched on. So I'm going to try to weave them all into that. But the one is the prayer of Rabbi al-Adawiya, where, you know, so famously it talks about this accounting, this divine accounting. And you point out that this is also in our human relationships where we pull back. You did this, you didn't do this, I did this, right? And so many worldly lovers, you know, are like that with their beloved, turn into that in our romantic relationships, but also so many religious people, it turns into that with God, right? And so she says, "Oh Lord, if I worship you for fear of hell, burn me in that hell. And if I worship you hoping for paradise, make it forbidden for me. But if I worship you only for your own sake, do not withhold from me your everlasting beauty." So this elevating beyond accounting. And there's another, I forget where it was, but it was in here somewhere, and it said something about, and perhaps you'll remember the exact reference, but it said, if only there were no heaven or no hell, then we'd see who really loves God.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's a constant refrain that we get in some parts of, you know, this particular tradition. You know, and one of the joys of having gone through you know, thousands and thousands of these poems and stories, and trying to figure out which one of them work in an English context, an English-speaking context, because aesthetics, of course, have changed, and you know, something that may work as a beautiful Persian ghazal may not necessarily work for a 21st century American English-speaking audience, right? But some of it, interestingly enough, does. And you know, a lot of people, of course, have heard of, you know, Rumi and Hafiz. I always tell people, whatever you've heard of Hafiz is fake. It's like hashtag fake Hafiz. 99% of all this stuff on the internet has nothing to do with Hafiz. Quite literally, it's all fabricated. It's not even like the Rumi stuff where the Islamic context is downplayed. The Hafiz stuff, literally, this charlatan made it up and published it as a book attributed to Hafiz.
Ladinsky, right?
Yeah. And so, but you know, people have heard of Rumi and Hafiz, but you know, we got so many giants in this tradition, in the same radical love tradition. And one of the ones that I love with all of my heart is not a particularly well-known guy named Kharaqani. And what a giant he was. He seems to have been a very simple person who has this extraordinarily tender love affair with God that at point almost becomes humorous, right? So, there's a wonderful story that Attar tells about Kharagani in which God wakes him up from his sleep. And in a rather stern voice, God says to him, his name is Abul Hassan. So he says, Abul Hassana, like Hassan's daddy, do you want me, as in God, to go and tell people every hypocrisy that there is in you? Do you want me to tell them every lack of righteousness that I know to be in your heart? And Kharghani doesn't miss a beat. He comes right back to God as a friend. And he says, my Lord, do you want me to go and tell people that you love them more than a mother loves her newborn child? Do you want me to tell them that you love them so much that you could never allow a single one of your creation to be cast into hellfire? And if I do, then I think none of them are going to pray or fast. And you almost imagine this banter as this affectionate, playful exchange between these two friends. Only one of them is the Lord of all creation. And then there's a long pause after Kharghani says this to God, and God comes back to him and says, I say nothing, you say nothing. Right? And the I say nothing, you say nothing, which sounds so colloquial in English, is actually literally what the Persian original of this text from more than 800 years ago said. And I love that story. I love the tenderness and the playfulness and the humor that there is in it, alongside, of course, the love and the obedience that goes into that same tradition.
Beautiful. Yeah, I want to get into, in a second, I'd like to get into discussing translation and that, because I'm interested in that. But first, there's one topic that, there's this idea of love, but it really gets down to, and you have many quotes that are really profound about this kind of mystery of the true selfhood of the human being vis-a-vis the divine. And in the most kind of profound, intimate of these poems and writings from this tradition, there is a like you said, there's almost an outward a blasphemy, something about that it's true non-duality, and they would say, of course, it's the true tawhid, but for people that are focused on the outward, it may be troubling. And there's an amazing quote that Maulana Rumi has, where he says, Pharaoh and Halaj, they said basically the same thing, which is, I am God, essentially. But Pharaoh said it from his individual ego. And Halaj said it from the absence of his individual ego. So in reality, they were saying the total opposite thing. And you have two quotes here that kind of touch on that. There's one from Iraqi, which is so short and sweet. God loves himself in you. And I'd love to hear deeper about that. But then there's this one from Attar where he says, I know without knowing. I don't know if you are I or I, you. I've lost two things, myself in you and duality. Myself in you and duality. So I'd love to hear just some of your thoughts about that.
I think in as much as I've been able to sit with and live with of this beautiful tradition, I think one of the things that I see is they love to give you a story, give you a metaphor, and then come at it from different points of view. Right. So, I mean, everybody, I think, has probably heard of, that wonderful kind of story of the elephant in the city of the blind man, right? Which is an old Buddhist Hindu text that enters Persian and Arabic sources and shows up in Kalila wa Dimna and kind of what have you. But, basically saying that in the city of the blind folk, the elephant is a bigger creation than they are, so each one of them can only feel a certain part of the elephant, right? And they do the same thing with language. So one of the really beautiful things is when you're reading the Masnavi, for example, in that first volume of the Masnavi, Rumi introduces that beautiful hadith that so many different folks have loved. Al-mu'min mir'atul mu'min. The faithful is the mirror of the faithful. And he gives you 3 or 4 different stories, all as a kind of reflection, commentary on that same saying. But in each one, he's showing you a different face of that same hadith. So the first time around, he's kind of like just uses it in a sense of, well, if you're in a brotherhood, a sisterhood, a spiritual community, you get to see qualities in other dervishes, in other beautiful human beings who are part of your community that you may not see in yourself. And you might also see ugly qualities in them, which is actually just a mirror being held up to you, right? And then he'll come back and he'll tell you a different story in which, the famous lion and the hare story, lion and the rabbit story, in which, the rabbit takes the lion to a well, and the well looks down, the lion looks down into the well and sees his own reflection, and he attacks. And the thing that he's attacking is himself. And then Rumi comes back to the same saying that, so often the thing that we hate in somebody else is actually a reflection of our own quality. So if there's somebody who really pushes your button, before you attack them, pause long enough and to see if they're teaching you something about yourself, right? So the first time around, it's about your spiritual community. The second time around, it could be something about a person that you've identified as the enemy or an obnoxious person. And then the third story that he gives you is also something about Al-Mu'min, of course, is one of the Asma al-Husna, is one of the names of Allah. And then he tells you, Al-Mu'min mir'atul mu'min, our task on this earth is to be a reflection of divine qualities. Right? So he tells you the same saying, but approaches it each time in a different context. And I think that's what the Sufis are doing with something like the notion of the self, the nafs, or the ego. So on one hand, you've got some of them who say very, simply that God is wherever your ego is not. Kharaqani, the same beautiful one that I talked about before, he's got a wonderful saying that I translated here as old skin. And he says, I shed my ego as a snake discards its old skin. And that there is a real self in you, and it's got to come out, and that has to come out of this bounded shell that you've imprisoned yourself in. And then when you do, you sort of get to a different kind of an understanding. They pick up on the parts of the Quran. God is with you wherever you are. That ever since your image came to call my heart home, wherever I sit is heaven. Right? And so I think they start to use the same words in very different contexts, in very different meanings. So for one of them, the nafs might be something that you have to discard. For another one, the nafs might be something that you've got to get to know really well. And they will tell you, you can't know Allah until and unless you get to know your own nafs well. And another time, they might tell you that you got to cook the nafs. You got to transform the nafs. And so I think in those kinds of contexts, it's very helpful to see these different Sufi teachings as representing the different parts of the elephant.
Yes.
And that's why ideally we wouldn't be reading these stories alone.
Right.
I think ideally we would be reading them in a community, or even better, with somebody who doesn't just know the poems, they've lived this poetry. Their very existence is this beauty. And then they know which story is the medicine for you and me tonight.
Sure.
And tomorrow we might need a different medicine.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful. And it brings up a lot relating to translation and the popularity of Sufi poetry in the Western context, and things of that nature. You mention in I believe the introduction, or you have a kind of note on translation where you mention that there's kind of two extremes in translation of Sufi poetry into English. One is represented by Nicholson Arbery, which is this kind of very academic, sometimes dry Victorian English, which has the virtue of usually being quite accurate, but is a bit difficult to access. I mean, you don't get the heart. It doesn't hit you in the heart. It's kind of cerebral. Whereas there's the other extreme where it's and it's usually Coleman Barks and others that are taking these poems and actually using Nicholson or Arbery's translation, usually not working directly from the Persian, and they're kind of putting it into a more modern free verse, almost kind of like beat poet-esque English. But in those, often it's kind of de-Islamicized because they're making choices for the common lay reader in the English-speaking world. And also, it tends to be a certain percentage Rumi and a certain percentage the translator, give or take each translator a poem. So whether it's 50-50 or 25-75, but I'd love to hear you talk about that and to maybe some of the difficulties, but also just the general phenomena of kind of Rumi being the number one selling poet and the great kind of universal star of the meme world and everything like that. So I'll just leave it with that question.
Yeah. So, I think I am in the interest of full transparency. I am closer to 50 than I am to 40. And if you and I were having this conversation 20 years ago, I think I would have, the way that many 20-year-olds, or at least me, I'll just speak for myself. I won't pretend to represent all 20-year-olds. At least the way I was in my 20s, there was a lot of anger at the fame that some of these other folks who are not Muslim, and I was suffering through grad school, learning medieval classical Persian and classical Arabic, and then learning the whole Sufi context from which these folks come from, and the technical meaning of the words, like that's hard work. Mm-hmm. And here I was, like, working my tail off, and then, I would see these non-Muslim folks who'd never bothered to learn these languages kind of getting rich off of these sayings, and it would get to me. So if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, I think I had, and I know I spent a lot of time preparing these, I had a whole long lecture on all the ways that Coleman Barks gets Rumi wrong, that he minimizes the Quran and the name of the Prophet, and that, I think my favorite example back then was there's that wonderful, beautiful poem that he has of there are hundreds of ways to bow down and kiss the ground. And if you let the beauty we love be what we do, there are hundreds of ways to bow down and kiss the ground. And, when you read the original Persian, Rumi is not at all talking about bowing down and kissing the ground. He's talking about sajda and ruku.
Prostrating.
And then prostrating in prayer and bowing down in front of the Almighty in the ritual prayer. And then for him then to say there's thousands of ways of doing your salat, right, of your daily prayer, like that's a really powerful and particularly Islamic statement. Yeah. And likewise, for Nicholson, I had a whole long list of critiques about this Orientalist scholar who never set foot in the Muslim majority world and had no interest in going because he actually thought that meeting Muslims was going to complicate the picture for him. Right? And that was me in my 20s. I think now that I am, I hope, finishing off the summer season of my life and entering the autumn season of my life, I'm a little more content these days to say, let everybody do the best that they can, and let me spend my own life, whatever I have left of it, not tearing somebody else down, but building up whoever's reading something that I might do. Mm-hmm. And I think, I look around at what's happening in the world today, and not just the obvious stuff, not just politics and, Nazis in the White House and what have you. Even among those of us who call ourselves Muslims and what have you, there's a lot of pettiness. There's a lot of meanness, and there's a lot of feeling like, my sheikh could take your sheikh kind of a language. And I don't want to be distracted by that kind of foolishness. So I think what I would say is trying to live a more generous life. Nicholson, for example, and Arbery said that they were not trying to write something that would be poetry in English. They did their work as a study guide for students of the Persian language, doing the best that they could to come up with a literal word-by-word translation. Right. But you know what? Nicholson also lost his eyesight in the process of editing Rumi's poetry. There was no critical edition. He collected all the manuscripts that he could get his hands on. He compiled them. He produced the critical edition. He did the full translation, which to this day is the only complete English translation. And he did a 2-volume commentary. MashaAllah. Like, what incredible service he provided to the lovers of Rumi in that way. And Also as far as like the Coleman Bark stuff is concerned, and yes, I do have some criticisms of some of the choices that Coleman makes, but he has introduced Rumi to millions of people around the world. Millions of people, including many Muslims whose first encounter with Rumi was not by learning Persian, but by picking up a Coleman Barks translation. And that's even true for a lot of native Persian speakers, though they will never admit that. So, mashallah. And if they read some parts of Rumi's poetry, and if at some point in life, one of these medicines disguised as poetry touched their heart, if it saved one person's life, what a beautiful service he has provided. So I think I just kind of where I am in this autumn season of life, I just want to do something good and something beautiful and have it come out of my heart and inshallah touch somebody else's heart. And that's enough. That's enough, I think, for me. And if I get to spend some of that time doing that and finding the most beautiful of the teachings and the stories and the poems, and not just translate them from one language to another, but really come up with something that sings in the new context, something that, when people say the prophets were sent to speak to people in their own language, that doesn't just mean that they came to speak to us in Arabic and Hebrew and Persian and Chinese. It means they knew how to reach us. They knew how to talk to us. They knew our stories and our metaphors, and they knew what worked for people. And I think to be a good translator, you have to know that. And, one of the things I love about you, my dear brother, is you do this. You do this in the beautiful work that you do, going deep into Islamic jewels and gems and Sufi aesthetics, and then putting it into spoken word and hip hop, which is today's global language, among many other ones. So I think that is translation. That is real work of reaching people where they are and where their hearts are.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing your kind of process and your journey as you reflected on that. And there were so many things you said in there which were actually really profound and just indicate, I think, that you've really sat with that and really reflected deeply. And I mean, I was particularly brought to tears by what you shared about Nicholson, literally losing his eyesight, dedicating himself to this. That was a fact I didn't know. And I thought of myself being a few Ramadans ago in Konya, poring over Nicholson's translations at night during Ramadan all night long. And it just really moved me that. And the other thing that you mentioned about Coleman Barks, on the other hand, is true for me too. My first, I first came in contact with Islam more through hip hop and Black Muslims that I was around growing up in, urban America in the 90s. But at the same time, I around the same time I came in contact with Rumi through Coleman Barks and through those popular translations. And so for me, it was that what really like sealed the deal for me about Islam is that it produced people like not only Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, but people like Rumi. And so it had deep, strive for justice in the world, but it came out of this deep, profound spirituality. And so, I actually have a deep, deep love and respect and gratitude for Coleman Barks, and I pray that anything good that I do is on his reward. Just same with Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and others, Rakim and Chuck D and all of them. But the thing is that exactly what you say is that, and an interesting parallel is, people could complain, for instance, Hindus could complain that yoga is now on every corner and it's just exercise and what is this? But how many people go to yoga just because they want a toned physique? And
Right.
then maybe something changes in them, or it gives them a sense of tranquility, or they see a picture of a guru on the wall, they pick up a deeper book about the spirituality or the philosophy, and it actually is a doorway into a deeper respect and understanding of that tradition. And likewise with Rumi, I mean, how many thousands of people have started out and just enjoyed it because it was wine and beloveds and all that, but then they said there's something deeper here, and they took it deeper. And I do see that among some Muslims, they complain about this, and sometimes I feel like some people really want Rumi to be like them, who are just mad and separating between people and who's a kafir and who's not. And you know what I mean? There it can be some,
Right.
right? Rumi was the faqih of the Hanafi madhab, and he,
Yes.
okay, he was, yes, and
Yes.
but there's a balance. He was also extremely critical of those who were veiled from the inward reality, and critical of his own self for the ways that he had been before his spiritual transformation. And so it's both, you have to affirm both of those realities. And Rumi has a message, and a loving critique of either side. People that would say he's just this universal mystic and take out Islam, and those that will try to pull him down to their level where he's just focused on praying and fasting just like me, and he's veiled from the actual opening to the spiritual realm. And so I do feel that, and also I think you kind of alluded to this, that and that's why I think you doing this work, and we pray that the work we're doing as well with our art is, we have no one to blame but ourselves if we're Muslims. Because if someone reads a beautiful popular translation of Rumi, or even academic translation of Rumi, and they're moved by it and they say, I want to experience this, and they go to their local mosque, are they going to find that deep love and that brotherhood and that focus on experiencing the divine beloved yourself, and complete non-judgment, not worrying what anyone thinks, but really just being with your creator and being with the fellow travelers on the path in complete brotherhood, sisterhood, and love? Or are they going to find other than that? And so if we aren't the people that are creating those spaces, then can we really critique, or blame others that are doing the work? So I totally respect what you say, and I think I also have gotten to that point where I'm actually deeply grateful to these people that came before, and now it's the time for us to continue on the work if we feel called to that.
Inshallah, and may it come from the heart. May it reach people's hearts, and may we also be willing to do the work, and then be willing to step back and let somebody else come and add their own spin to it, to put their own flavor on it. That like I said, all of us, we want to do something that's beautiful and is efficacious, but we don't get to have the last word on any of these. And I think one of the temptations that's out there, and I've certainly felt this temptation in my own heart, is we want to own these giants. We want to own Rumi, and we want to own Hafiz, instead of kind of realizing that they were owned by Allah. They had gone on their own journey of love into God's own embrace. And the best thing that we can do is not to try to monopolize and to put a trademark after Rumi's name. It's to swim into that same current of love and to end up somewhere close to where they did. And I think that's the most loving and luminous thing that any of us can do.
That's great. Well, there's a lot to reflect on, and thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast. I want to let you let people know where they can find the book, as well as where they can connect with you if you have a website or on social media, or find any of your other works. So feel free to just give a shout out so listeners can.
Well, I'll tell you. I will give you that, but I will tell you something maybe even hopefully more beautiful, which is when Rumi was getting very close to passing away. One of his disciples asked him, "Where am I going to find you after you're gone? Where am I going to find somebody like you after you're gone?" And I think what he told them is something that I hope all of us can stay mindful of, and I wish there was a word heartful of, is he said, sit with these teachings, sit with these poems, sit with these stories, and examine your heart. And if there's ever a joy that comes to you when you sit with them, open up that joy. And that's where I am. And I've always loved that, because I think at the end of the day, what matters is not if somebody follows you on Twitter and on Facebook, because, none of that stuff is coming into the grave with me. I think what matters is, does it help somebody discover that divine joy inside their own heart? Does it help bring them just a little tiny bit closer to Allah? And if they have, then alhamdulillah. Then I think that work had barakah, and that's at the end of the day, I think what we all kind of want. But I will also answer your question, since you ask, and because there's an adab to also answering people's questions. So the book is called Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition. They can find it on Amazon. They can find it from the local bookstore. I am on Facebook and Twitter and all those kind of things. And probably one of the most joyful things that I'd love to invite people to do, if they're ever inclined and interested, is there's a program I run that's called Illuminated Tours. And it's got a website, illuminatedtours.com. And we just take people and go for 10 days. So far, it's either to Turkey or Morocco. Someday, inshallah, it might also be India. May it someday also be Iran. But right now, it's in Turkey and Morocco. And it's basically 10 days of being in very beautiful and sacred places and talking about these teachings of the radical love path. We oftentimes read Rumi or other great masters of the path of love. And we also try to connect with the local indigenous tradition, so that when we're in Turkey, we get a real flavor of what the Turkish path of love has been. And then when we're in Morocco, we try to connect with the Moroccan tradition that is there. And that, alhamdulillah, has been something I've been blessed to do for about 15 years. And it's one of the more joyful things that I get to do.
Thank you for listening to Path and Present podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so in a few ways. One is word of mouth. People hear about the podcast mostly from people like you who listen and like it and say, I know someone who would connect with this, or who would feel this, or who would enjoy this subject matter. So continue to share with your family and friends. Secondly, you can subscribe, rate, and comment on the iTunes page of Path and Present. Subscribing means that the podcast each episode will come directly to you when we release it. And rating and commenting means that it will grow and come up in the iTunes rankings, which will allow it to be available and seen by more people. And then lastly, you can support financially on Patreon. Patreon is a site which allows people to give a small amount monthly to support art or any type of content. And we have a Path and Present page on Patreon. The link is on our SoundCloud page, SoundCloud/Path and Present. And you'll find the Patreon link there. And yeah, you can support there. We're greatly appreciative of it. I guess lastly, keep us in your prayers, your positive thoughts, and your moments of remembrance. And thank you for tuning in and being part of the global Path and Present family. One love.